Get out from under there, Duke. Maeve's voice cracked through the cold morning air, sharp with a kind of urgency that made her German shepherd freeze mid-scratch. The frost still clung to the brittle grass in their backyard, each breath hanging pale and ghostly in the November light. Duke's ears flicked at her tone, but instead of backing away, he ducked lower, paws working furiously at the frozen soil beneath the old garden shed. Maeve knew that sound, the steady thud of paws against dirtment. He'd caught a scent. Living at the edge of Hollow Creek meant raccoons, opossums, sometimes foxes slipped under fences. Normally she let him chase the shadows, but today, something in the way he growled low, steady, almost trembling, unraveled her. She stepped forward, boots sinking slightly into the cold ground, and crouched near the shed's weathered boards. Duke, whatever it is, leave it. Her voice softened, but the words tasted hollow. Then she heard it so faint, she thought it might be the wind, a cry high and thin, like the sound of glass splintering in the dark. Duke froze mid-dig, head cocked toward the noise, then doubled his effort, claws pulling cold earth like a machine. Maeve's pulse rose. The cry came, again, clearer this time, and not the wild snarl of a trapped animal. It was fragile, desperate, alive. She pulled off her gloves and dropped to her knees beside him, fingers brushing against the loose soil. Duke glanced at her, eyes bright, then lowered his head and wedged his body into the gap he'd made. Maeve's heart tripped when he emerged, jaws gentle, holding a clump of damp leaves and something so small it barely stirred. She reached for it, and Duke released his hold with a soft whine. It was a kitten, so tiny she could see the pulse fluttering beneath its paper-thin skin. Its fur matted with mud, paws no bigger than the buttons on Maeve's coat. It blinked once, slow, its breath a fragile thread between life and nothing. She curled it into her palms, feeling the chill that clung to it like a shadow. "Sweetheart," she whispered, not sure if she was speaking to the kitten or herself. Duke nosed her arm, eyes locked on the trembling creature. Maeve had never seen that look on him before, fierce and tender all at once. She rose quickly, cradling the kitten against her chest as Duke followed at her heel. Inside, the house felt warmer than it had a moment ago, the kitchen filling with the smell of last night's coffee and the faint trace of lavender from the candle she'd left burning. She wrapped the kitten in a dish towel and set it near the stove, her hands already fumbling for a shallow bowl and the carton of goat's milk she'd kept for baking. The kitten's first sip was hesitant, tongue flicking like it wasn't sure if survival was worth the effort. But Maeve had seen that kind of will before, the kind that hid in the smallest bodies, waiting for just enough warmth to spark it alive. Duke lay down beside the stove, chin resting on his paws, eyes never leaving the bundle in the towel. As the morning stretched on, Maeve found herself thinking of the shed, of how many nights the kitten had spent under there alone. She wondered if its mother had been taken by a hawk, or if the cold had driven her to abandon the weakest of the litter. There was no answer, just the quiet rhythm of the kitten's breathing, a little steadier now, and the soft weight of Duke's watchfulness beside her. By late afternoon, the sky over Hollow Creek had turned the color of pewter, and the wind carried the smell of snow. Maeve sat on the floor, her back against the stove, the kitten tucked against her chest. Duke shifted closer, pressing his body into hers, as if making a silent promise. She realized then that what Duke had pulled from under the shed wasn't just a life, it was a thread, weaving its way through the cold edges of her own quiet winter. And in that small, flickering heartbeat pressed against her, she felt something she hadn't in a long time. Not just the urge to protect, but the certainty that, even in the frozen places, warmth could still be found if you were willing to dig for it. Maeve barely slept that night. The storm rolled in after sunset, rattling the windows and pressing darkness against the glass. Every now and then she'd rise from the couch to check on the kitten, still swaddled in the towel near the stove, its tiny chest rising and falling like a faint echo. Duke didn't move from his post beside it, ears twitching at every snap of wind. At 2 in the morning, when the snow finally began to fall in thick, slanting sheets, Maeve brewed herself a cup of tea and sat on the floor beside them both, letting the heat from the stove seep into her bones. She found herself speaking softly to the kitten as though it could understand. "You've made quite the entrance, little one. No idea where you came from, do you?" The kitten's eyes were still half shut, but a faint purr vibrated against her palm. Duke's gaze followed every movement, his head tilting when Maeve stroked the kitten's frail spine. It was as if he sensed a secret in the tiny things present, something Maeve couldn't yet name. By morning, the storm had left the world silent and white. Maeve wrapped the kitten in a scarf and stepped outside, Duke bounding ahead, scattering fresh snow in his wake. She needed to check the shed, to see if there were more like it hidden beneath. But when she knelt at the same spot Duke had dug the day before, the cold air stung her lungs. She saw no sign of a nest, just claw marks in the frozen ground and a patch of disturbed earth leading deeper toward the foundation. Her heart sank. If there had been siblings, they hadn't made it through the night. Back inside, she warmed her hands over the stove and glanced toward the kitten. It had curled itself into the hollow of Duke's front legs, as if the shepherd were the only safe place left in the world. Maeve caught herself staring, a tightness growing in her chest. Duke had never been one for gentleness, and with his toys, Not with the squirrels he chased along the fence line, but here he was, breathing in time with a creature so fragile it could be gone in an instant. She called her neighbor, Caleb, who had lived on the edge of Hollow Creek longer than anyone else. He knew the land, the strays, and every sound the wind carried. A kitten, you say? His voice crackled through the old phone line. We had a feral queen birthing under sheds last spring. Thought she'd moved on. Maybe not. Maeve hesitated, then asked if he'd seen her recently. Caleb paused for a long moment. Saw her 2 nights ago, limping bad, heading toward the woods. The thought of a wounded mother out there gnawed at her. Maeve knew the woods well, how the cold seeped in, how the silence could feel endless. She pulled on her coat and boots, tucking the kitten back into the warmth by the stove. Stay, she told Duke, though the way he shifted made it clear he didn't intend to listen. The forest beyond Hollow Creek had its own kind of hush in winter, a layered stillness broken only by the crunch of Maeve's boots and the faint jingle of Duke's collar. She scanned the undergrowth, looking for any sign tracks, fur movement, but found only the brittle remains of last year's grass pushing through snow. Then Duke stopped so abruptly she nearly stumbled over him. His ears were rigid, his body low, eyes locked on a shadow at the base of a fallen log. Maeve stepped forward slowly. A shape emerged, thin, hunched, barely breathing. The cat's coat, once sleek black, was patchy with frost and dirt. One hind leg was twisted, and her eyes, wide and glassy, flicked to Maeve with a wariness sharpened by survival. She didn't move, even as Duke inched closer. Tail low in a non-threatening sweep, Maeve crouched, speaking in a voice just above a whisper. It's all right, we're here now. The cat's gaze darted past her, toward the direction of the shed. Maeve felt the meaning settle in her chest. She knew exactly what the cat was asking without words. She reached into her coat pocket and pulled out a small piece of cooked chicken she'd brought on a hunch. The scent carried between them. The cat's nose twitched, and after a long hesitation she took a slow step forward. The journey back was delicate. Maeve cradled the limp, trembling mother against her chest while Duke trotted ahead, tail flicking in short bursts like he was urging her onward. At the cabin, she placed the cat on a blanket near the stove, the kitten stirring. At the scent of her, the reunion was fragile. No frantic mews, no sudden rush, just a soft, rasping sound as the kitten pressed against its mother's chest. The faintest purr answering in return. Maeve sat back, the air in the kitchen thick with warmth and something else, something heavier. The mother's condition was worse than she'd realized. Frostbite nipped at her ears, her leg injury looked old and unhealed, and her breathing was shallow. Maeve's stomach tightened with the knowledge that not all rescues came with guarantees. For hours she stayed close, feeding both the kitten and its mother, watching Duke keep his silent vigil. Outside, the snow kept falling, piling against the shed, erasing the traces of where they had dug. Maeve thought about the fragile thread that had brought them all here, Duke's stubborn digging, the cry under the shed, the shadow in the woods, and how easily it might have been missed by nightfall. The mother had eaten a little, her eyes softening each time the kitten nuzzled her. Maeve rested her head against the wall, exhaustion settling into her bones. But there was a steady hum of something deeper beneath its relief, maybe, or gratitude. Duke shifted beside her, his head resting on her knee, gaze never leaving the pair by the stove. She realized then that the story wasn't about a dog finding a kitten, or even about survival. It was about the quiet, stubborn ways living things reach for each other in the cold, and the choices made in those small, unremarkable moments that change everything. And though she didn't know what tomorrow would bring for the fragile family on her kitchen floor, Maeve knew one thing with certainty: Duke had pulled far more than a kitten from under that shed. He had pulled a piece of her own heart into the light. The third day after Duke's discovery began in a silence that felt wrong. Maeve woke before dawn, the kind of gray hour when the house still carried the night's chill, and found the little kitten curled in its towel nest, unmoving. Her breath caught in her throat, and for a moment she couldn't tell if it was breathing. Duke was already beside it, his nose pressed so close Maeve feared he might startle it. Then, the faintest rise and fall of its tiny chest made her knees weaken with relief, but the movement was slow to slow. She scooped it into her hands, feeling how light it was, as if the night had stolen more than warmth from its body. "You're not giving up now," she murmured, though the words trembled. She warmed fresh milk, coaxing a few drops between its lips, but the kitten turned away, its head lolling against her fingers. Panic bloomed in her chest, sharp and cold. She'd told herself she could do this, that she could keep it alive, but now the weight of that promise pressed hard. Duke paced, nails clicking on the worn kitchen floor, his eyes darting from her face to the kitten. He let out a sound she'd never heard from him before, low, breathy whimper that seemed almost human. Maeve felt the sting of tears as she tucked the kitten under her sweater, pressing it against her skin for warmth. The rhythm of her heartbeat, she hoped, might be enough to remind the little creature what it was supposed to do: keep fighting. By midday, the clouds had thickened, and the first flakes of snow drifted past the kitchen window. Maeve sat cross-legged on the rug, the kitten swaddled in a scrap of wool. Duke lay nearby, his body stretched out like a shield, She kept talking softly, recounting stories to the kitten about the stray tabbies she'd found as a child, about the winter storms that rattled this old house, about the way Duke had once dug up an entire garden bed just to unearth a tennis ball. She spoke because silence felt dangerous, as if quiet might give the kitten permission to fade. Then, in the middle of her rambling, the kitten twitched, its mouth opened, a tiny cry escaping, thin but insistent. Maeve's heart jolted. Duke's head shot up, ears forward. The kitten wriggled weakly, searching, and when Maeve touched the bottle to its lips, it latched on with a surprising urgency. The milk spilled over its chin, soaking the wool, but she didn't care. She laughed through the tears that blurred her vision. Feeling the weight in her chest loosen for the first time that day, the reprieve didn't last. That evening, as the snow thickened and the world outside blurred into white, Maeve noticed something else: teeny tremors running through the kitten's body. Not the shivers of cold, but a restless twitching that made its breathing uneven. She wrapped it tighter, whispering, trying to will it calm, but the tremors kept coming, each one a reminder of how fragile this fight still was. Duke wouldn't leave her side. When she moved to the couch, he jumped up too, pressing close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating off him. His eyes never strayed from the bundle in her hands. It struck Maeve. Then he wasn't just curious. He knew, somehow, in the way animals understand without words. He recognized how close this line was between holding on and letting go. The night stretched long. Every time Maeve's head began to nod, a small sound from the kitten snapped her awake. She thought of calling the vet in town, but the roads were already closing under the snow, and the thought of jostling the kitten in the bitter cold seemed riskier than staying put. Instead, she stayed curled on the couch, Duke's steady breathing at her side, the kitten's fragile heartbeat under her palm. It was just after midnight when Maeve felt it a shift, so small she almost missed it. The kitten's breathing evened, its body relaxing in a way that spoke not of giving in, but of finding some reserve of strength. Duke shifted too, lifting his head and sniffing at the bundle before settling again with a deep sigh. Maeve closed her eyes briefly, letting the quiet settle around them, but her mind kept circling back to one thought. She had found the kitten because of Duke's stubborn digging, but maybe, in some quiet, impossible way, the kitten had been meant for him too. By dawn, the snow outside lay deep and undisturbed, the world wrapped in a kind of stillness that made Maeve pause at the window. Inside, the kitten stirred against her chest, its tiny claws kneading at the fabric of her sweater. The fight wasn't over, not by a long stretch, but for the first time, she let herself believe they might win it. Duke patted over, pressing his head against her knee, and she realized that whatever came next, they were in it together. The shed out back seemed impossibly far away now, buried in snow, its shadow no longer hiding the secret that had changed the rhythm of her days. And in that soft, uncertain light of morning, Maeve understood something she hadn't when this began. Sometimes the smallest lives carry the heaviest weight, pulling you into battles you didn't expect to fight. But can't imagine walking away from Maeve had barely slept the night before. The storm had come in fast, rattling the shed roof and drumming against the kitchen window. Each gust of wind felt like it might blow the fragile warmth right out of the house. She had kept the kitten close to her chest, wrapped in an old wool scarf, listening to the small, uneven breaths that seemed to echo her own fear. Duke had stayed curled at her feet the entire night, his head occasionally lifting whenever the kitten let out a soft cry. It was the kind of night that stripped away any illusion of safety, and Maeve couldn't shake the thought of what might have happened if Duke hadn't started digging that morning. By dawn, the storm had left behind a white world. The yard was buried in snow, and the shed looked smaller somehow, its roof hunched under the weight. Maeve stood at the window with a cup of coffee that had gone cold in her hands, her mind replaying the faint cry they'd heard from beneath those warped boards. There was something about it that still gnawed at her. That sound had been more than just one voice. She was certain now there had been others. She dressed in her heaviest coat, stuffing her pockets with old towels, and whistled for Duke. He sprang up immediately, his ears already tuned to the outside. The snow was deep enough to swallow her boots as she trudged toward the shed, the air sharp in her lungs. Duke led the way, nose low, tail stiff with focus. When they reached the edge of the shed, he stopped abruptly, sniffing the air in short bursts before pawing at the same spot he had dug yesterday. Maeve knelt beside him, scraping away the new snow until her gloves brushed against the frozen ground. The first sound came quickly, a faint, muffled whimper that made her chest tighten. She shifted to lie flat on her stomach, pressing her ear to the small gap in the boards. This time, she heard it clearly. Not one, but two voices, weak and struggling. She didn't think. She simply began to dig. The earth was hard and unyielding, the cold cutting through her gloves until her fingers ached, but she kept going, Duke working beside her in a frantic rhythm. After what felt like forever, her hands broke through into a hollow space beneath the shed. Two more kittens. One mottled gray, its eyes barely open, the other a pale cream, trembling so hard it seemed to vibrate in her palm when she lifted it out. They were even colder than the first, their tiny bodies limp with exhaustion. Maeve tucked them inside her coat, close against her skin, and closed her eyes for a moment, letting her breath steady before heading back to the house. Duke followed close, his paws crunching in the snow, his gaze fixed on her coat as if guarding the precious life inside it. Inside, the kitchen felt like an entirely different world. The heat from the stove enveloped them, the scent of wood smoke curling through the air. Maeve placed the kittens in a shallow basket lined with warm towels. The first kitten, the one Duke had rescued yesterday, lifting its head weakly to sniff at them. The sight of them together, 3 fragile threads of life huddled for warmth, sent a rush of emotion through her that caught her off guard. She had lived alone for so long that she'd almost forgotten what it felt like to be needed so completely. But the relief didn't last long. As she tried to feed the new arrivals, she noticed the cream-colored kitten was barely swallowing, its tiny jaw trembling with the effort. A cold wave of dread swept over her. She had read enough about orphaned kittens to know that time was not on their side. "Stay with me," she whispered, her voice breaking. Duke, sensing the shift in her tone, pressed his head against her leg, his warm breath ghosting through the fabric of her jeans. The hours blurred. Maeve worked in quiet desperation, alternating between warming milk, rubbing tiny paws to stimulate circulation, and checking their breathing. Outside, the snow began to fall again, soft and relentless, as though the world had folded in on itself. Every so often she caught Duke watching her with that same fierce, steady gaze he had worn when he pulled the first kitten from the earth. By late afternoon, the cream kitten's breathing steadied just enough for her to unclench her hands from the towel. She sat back on her heels, exhaustion rolling through her in waves, and looked around the small kitchen. The firelight cast a golden glow over the basket, the 3 tiny bodies nestled together in a knot of shared warmth. For the first time in years, the house didn't feel empty. It felt like something was beginning to grow inside it again, something that had nothing to do with walls or furniture. She reached down to stroke Duke's head, her fingers brushing through the thick fur between his ears. "You knew," she murmured, not as a question, but as a truth. He leaned into her touch, his eyes half closed, and in that quiet snow-dimmed moment, she realized the real twist in this story wasn't just that Duke had found the first kitten. It was that he had somehow known the others were still out there waiting for someone who would come for them. Maeve glanced at the basket once more, the smallest bodies she had ever held, now breathing in fragile unison, and felt the air in her chest shift outside. The snow kept falling, but here, inside this warm pocket of light, they were safe, and for the first time in a long while, so was she. The snow had stopped by nightfall, leaving the world outside hushed and silvered under the moon. Maeve sat in the quiet kitchen, the basket of kittens beside her, their tiny chests rising and falling in perfect rhythm. Duke lay close, his paw resting lightly against the wicker as though to keep them from drifting too far. She watched the fire's glow spill across their faces, each one still impossibly small, yet alive because he had refused to give up. In that stillness, she understood this was not just a rescue. It was a reminder that even in the coldest seasons, something fierce and good could dig its way through the frozen earth and find its way to the light. And as the warmth of the room wrapped around them all, Maeve realized that Duke hadn't just brought her kittens, he had brought her back to herself.